My name is Marty. Welcome to this video series on building your own TE style electric guitar kit from Guitar Kit World. So in the following video I'm going to show you how I put together this particular guitar. We're going to cover the four main areas of kit guitar building, including finishing, installing your hardware, connecting up your electronics, and then doing a basic final setup. So if you've never built a kit guitar before or don't have specialist tools, don't worry, I'm not a luthier myself. In fact, I'm not even all that handy. But just about anyone can put together a guitar like this, just with the basic tools and a little bit of patience. Okay, so the guitar we're working with today is a TE style guitar kit featuring mahogany body, maple neck, engineered ebony fretboard with dot inlays, and of course the ashtray style bridge with single coil pickup in the back and single coil pickup at the neck. We've also got three-way selector switch, tone and volume. Okay, so from here I'm going to take the video back to the very start of the build, and we're going to start by putting the guitar up on the bench and inspecting the body for any marks or scratches. Okay, so I've got the TE kit up on the bench now. The first thing to do before we inspect the body is just to remove this pickguard. It'll just be held in place by a couple of small screws, so I'll quickly take those out. And now we can have a closer look at the body. So what we're looking for are scratches or imperfections that we need to sand out before we start applying any finishing product. So most of the time the guitars come out of the factory already sanded to about 320 grit, which is a good surface for applying finish to. So what we're really just doing is looking for any marks or scratches. So a common place this might occur is around the bottom where you get machine marks. You can just see some evidence of that now. Running my hand over that, so we'll give that a light sand. The other place to inspect is the horns. This one looks pretty good. I've just got some 320 grit paper here. What I'm going to do is just lightly sand the surface. I've got a hard sanding block. So the reason we use a hard sanding block and not one of these molded sanding blocks, especially on flat surfaces, are this will conform to any bumps. So basically, what you're going to do is the softer backing is just going to allow those bumps to remain in place, where a hard block like this, when you're sanding, it's just going to sand it flat. So that's what we're trying to do. So as I mentioned, this TE is a mahogany kit, so to get a nice flat finish we're going to need to grain fill it and then prime. So grain filling is really the process of filling in the pores of the timber. What I prefer to use is a dedicated grain filler. Now the one I'm using in this instance is just a natural grain filler from Timbermate. It should be mixed to a fairly runny consistency, more like a glue, I guess. I've mixed that with about 20% or 20% water. You can tint grain filler as well if you like. Many people do that to accentuate the grain. So if I had a nice, like a nice spalted maple or something like that, I might want to rub some dark stain in with the grain fill and then get that right into the pores. And then when I sand it back, the grain will be accentuated. So we've left our TE kit to dry overnight. It had 2 coats of grain fill yesterday. And now I'm just coming back and removing all the excess, so just sanding it down. So what I'd recommend using is a higher grit paper, like a 400 or a 600 grit paper should suffice. And what you're really trying to do is just sand flush with the surface of the timber. So when you're sanding, you're not trying to remove any timber at all. We're just trying to get it flush with the surface, and that will mean that the pores that we filled yesterday remain filled. So I'll just start sanding, and I'll sand a section and we'll bring the camera down, just have a look at what I'm talking about there. As you can see in this corner here, you can probably see that we've removed most of the excess, but the pore marks, the tiny pore marks, are still filled, which is basically what we're trying to do. So if you did sand too far, or if those pore marks weren't filled enough, you may need to consider a third coat, and I'd probably make that third coat a little runnier, so add a little bit more water next time. Okay, so that's the guitar all prepped and ready for priming. So got the masking in place. Good thing about a TE style kit, there's less cavities to mask up, but that's pretty much the job. We've grain filled, we've sanded back the grain fill, we've masked up the cavities, cleaned the timber, so now it's time to prime. First step when you doing any sort of painting obviously is to shake the can up really well. Okay, so what I normally do is just start with the sides. So this means there's less overspray. Now I'm putting this on very lightly. This first coat is really just a dust coat. So about 6 to 8 inches from the guitar. Just work your way around. Let that dry for about 10 minutes and then come back and do your second coat. This has actually turned out quite well. There's not too much grit on the surface or anything. It was a pretty good day for spraying really. I sprayed outside and there wasn't too much dust or grit flying around, which is good. I also hung the guitar inside to dry so that it couldn't get any grit caught up in the finish. So what we've got here is a pretty good job. What I'll be doing is just sanding with a 220 grit paper and just trying to scuff up the surface, basically make sure it's nice and level so that our solid colour coats that we follow up with adhere well. Now, a couple of things I'd recommend, tips I'd recommend to avoid sand throughs. I never really sand edges. You'll find your edges are really quite thin anyway. So what I tend to prefer doing is just avoid the edges and sand the main flat surfaces of the body. At least with the 220 grit or something like that anyway. Just keep cleaning your sandpaper out, change the sandpaper as required, and don't go for a mirror flat finish here. We're really just trying to scuff up the surface so that our next coat will take nicely. Okay, so I'm back out in the yard again. I'm going to give a solid colour coat to our TE guitar kit. As you can see, it's a little bit of an overcast day. I've checked the weather though, there's no immediate threat of rain, so I'm not too concerned, but obviously that's something to keep an eye on as well. So I've shaken up my can, shaking this up for about a minute. Now, you shake cans up for about a minute after you hear the rattle of the ball inside. And we'll just be spraying just the same way we sprayed our primer. So I'll start with the edges and the sides first. I'll be hiding the can on an angle towards the guitar, about 6 to 8 inches from the guitar. And when I do my front and back, I'll be doing long passes and overlapping the spray by about 50% each time. Okay, so we'll do our first coat now. Okay, so I'm about to do my second coat. One thing I like to do between coats, I've got some boiling water down here. What I do is dip the nozzle in the water, which just unclogs the nozzle and prevents any large droplets sort of coming out in the first spray onto the guitar. So I'll just do that. So before you do all these things, if you follow the correct procedures, you cut down on the amount of sanding you do and the amount of solid colour coats you need to put on the guitar. So I'll do the second coat now, just same as the first, but I'll apply it just a little bit heavier. I've just got some 800 grit paper here. I'm just going to lightly just rough that paint up a little bit. Your sandpaper is going to clog up a little at this stage, so just be sure to continually be cleaning off your paper and also cleaning off the surface of the guitar. I'm just going to apply the first coat of clear gloss now, giving this can a good shake up, but generally, as per the colour coats, when you hear the rattle, shake for about a minute, and we're just going to follow the same principles we did with the colour coat. So, not applying too thick. We're trying to avoid runs. Going around the sides and back first, and working our way in long passes, just overlapping by about 50% each time. So, we'll see how we go. So I've just had to change camera angles. It's a very hot day here today, and my phone was actually overheating in the heat. So That's another good reason to not hang your guitars outside. Obviously we don't want to hang our guitars outside on windy days anyway, because a lot of dust can build up on the surface, but you also don't want the paint getting too hot. So what I'd recommend is hanging your guitar when you're finished in a cool, relatively dry area. Okay, so ready to do my second coat now, and same practice as before, except this time I'll be cleaning out the nozzle. I've got some hot water here. I'm just going to give the nozzle a quick dip in that, and then give it a quick spray just to clear out any build up around the nozzle. And we'll just apply the same approach as last time, only this time I'll probably apply it just a little bit thicker. So I'm going to let that dry for another 10 minutes and then spray a third coat, and that will do us for today. I'll then leave the guitar to hang in a cool place downstairs, and we'll come back and assess our work tomorrow. I'd say from there I'll probably scuff up the clear coat just a little bit more and repeat the process over the next 3 days. So what I'll be looking to do is get about 9 coats of clear on this guitar. So that's the method. That's what I'd recommend to do. And again, just remember, windy days like today, if you can spray inside, it's going to be better. You won't build up as much dust on the surface of your wet paint. There's differences between finishing bodies and necks, so largely that's with consideration to making the neck playable. So we don't want to use anything too thick, basically, particularly on the back of the neck where our hand rests against it as we play. We don't want too much friction from our hands against the finish. So regardless of what product you use, what I'd recommend is a matte finish on the back of the guitar. So even if you spray a clear gloss, which we're going to do in this instance, I'll then finish that with a fine grade steel wool just to really buff that down to a matte finish, and that means hands won't get caught up or slowed down while we're playing the guitar. We're going to have to definitely mask off our truss rod. We don't want gunk building up in there, and we're going to mask off our tuning holes as well. But for now, we'll give the guitar a sand. So I'd start with a 180 grit. Just a 180 grit, and work our way up from there. Just use your sanding block on the actual headstock itself. It's nice and flat, so we can generally achieve a really nice flat finish there. That's really all I'm doing, is sanding flat with the 180, and then we'll follow up with some 240, some 320, and then some 400 just to remove the scratch marks from the heavier grades of paper that we've used. What I like to do, there are probably more efficient methods of doing this, but just use some tape bunched into a ball, like so. Have the sticky side out, and that way it'll catch. That's why it'll catch anything coming in contact with that area of the guitar, and will also stick within the truss rod hole. Now we really do want to make sure that truss rod cover, of all things, is taken care of, because you get too much finish on the end of the truss rod's not going to function correctly. Otherwise, then we'll do the tuning peg holes as well, and the reason for that is we don't want a lot of finish going down inside those holes, because you'll get a build-up of gunk, which will then make the tuners harder to install. Okay, now we've masked off our TE neck. The next thing we want to do is apply our clear gloss. So I'm using this Rust-Oleum clear gloss. It's a water-based gloss, so very fast drying. I'll aim to get about 3 coats on that today. So shake up the can and long passes across the headstock first. And then because the headstock sits down recessed in that way, we can simply turn it over and spray the rest. Okay, just coming up to my third and final coat for the day. Just want to point out a couple of things. So I'm only applying about 3 coats to this, and I'm going to gently sand back the heel. But if you're applying many thick coats, as you can see, that heel will have a lot of finish on it, and that can affect your action. So if you are planning on spraying many coats on the back of your neck, for instance, just make sure you fit the neck into the guitar itself, and just using a pencil or something similar, make a mark as to where the guitar extends out from the pocket, and mask off that area that's going to sit in the pocket. So I've got the TE kit back up on the bench. It's had 10 coats of clear gloss and about 5 days to dry. From here, what we want to do next is start flat sanding that clear gloss. So hopefully you can see, especially where the light's reflecting off the body, there's a peel effect, or an orange peel effect to the paint. And what that's really telling us is there's areas of unevenness in our paint, and that's why the light's reflecting differently. So what we want to do next, taking about an 800 grit paper, something fairly fine, and a nice hard sanding block, we just want to start working that unevenness out of the paint. So I'm not sanding aggressively when I'm doing this, I'm just working the paint and removing that shine. As you can see, there's already quite a difference there. There's less shine to that area, but we also don't have that peel effect. And that's really what we're trying to do right across the guitar. So I'm going to sand this for the next few hours using my 800 grit. I'm going to be careful around the edges because the paint doesn't accumulate well there. And we'll check back in and see how progress is going then. So I've been sanding for a couple of hours now, and hopefully you can see on camera we've removed almost all of that orange peel. There might be a few little specks here and there, but generally the next finer grit of paper will remove that. So I'm moving up now to a 1200 grit paper. I'm just repeating the same process. I'm just basically removing the scratch marks left from the previous grade of paper. This stage normally doesn't take as long as the initial sanding. There's obviously less work for the paper to do. So I've finished up with the 1200 grit now, and if I hold the guitar up to the light, hopefully you're seeing a reduction in those scratch marks. Admittedly, white's a little hard to see on camera, but that's another thing to keep in mind. If this is your first guitar and you're choosing a colour, white's actually a pretty forgiving colour, unlike black, which will tend to highlight every scratch that you leave in the guitar. Okay, so from here I'm going to get onto a little bit of wet sanding. Now I've left this 1500 grit soaking overnight, and you don't need to do that, but it's generally recommended. It softens up the grit, and the paper's just easier to work with. So from here, again, I'm just going to use my sanding block. Now it's important to use a fair bit of water when you're wet sanding. Now you don't have to wet sand again. If you do, generally I like to work with a higher grit paper when I do that. Now a couple of things to keep in mind when you're wet sanding guitar bodies. Obviously we've got holes on the body themselves, and water gets in those holes. There's ingrain, unsealed timber in there that's going to swell up if it gets too moist. So definitely have a rag nearby, and just continually be removing any moisture that accumulates around those holes. So I'm not sure if this is showing up on camera, but certainly from my perspective, I can still see some tiny scratches, but you really need to have the guitar on an angle and reflecting light to see that. So as I said, you don't need to wet sand. It's just a final step I do before using a fine grade steel wool. So I'll finish the wet wet sanding, and now I'm just going to follow up with some fine grade steel wool. So this super fine grade steel wool you can generally pick up at your local hardware store, and what this will essentially do is remove any scratch marks left from the previous high grade of paper. So I've been polishing away over on this side for the last couple of minutes. I'm just going to hold the guitar up to the light. As I said, it's difficult to see in these lighter colours, but I hope you can see a matte finish there. I'll bring the guitar down. I'll bring the camera down, sorry. And hopefully you can see now there's no scratch marks left there, but we've got a much duller finish compared to, say, over here. And that's what the steel wool does. It gives you that matte finish. And if you wanted a matte finish on your guitar, you could pretty much stop after this stage. Now, when you do use steel wool, a lot of people don't like using steel wool, and there's a couple of reasons for that. Generally, when you're using steel wool, it leaves a lot of steel fibres on the guitar, so that can be a problem. So if you're using steel wool and a lot of fibres get caught up in your cavities, for example, and your next stage is polishing, you may turn the guitar over and those fibres end up in your workspace. And as you're applying a lot of force while you're polishing, you're pressing those fibres against the surface, and also because you're heating up the surface when you're polishing, those steel fibres are likely to embed into the guitar more. And the other thing to keep in mind also is with regards to hardware and electronics, especially the pickups, which are essentially magnets. We don't want any steel fibres left on the guitar, so that are going to be drawn to the pickups. So what I'd suggest, I still use steel wool myself. I think it's worth doing, but you do want to give the guitar a thorough clean off afterwards. So as I said, we've got a nice matte, dull sort of finish from here. We're going to bring that gloss back by applying some polish. So I've got two grades. I'm just using an automotive polish here. I'm firstly using a cutting compound, a heavy duty cutting compound, and I'll follow that up with a super fine cut. And I've got two clean rags here. And really, if you've ever polished a car before, it's the same situation. We're just rubbing in the polish, and we're working it pretty hard. Again, this is why it's a good idea to have definitely removed any metal fibres from the steel wool at this stage. And I'm just really working that almost as hard as I can into the paint. I've finished polishing up the TE body. As you can see, we've got that nice reflective surface back on the guitar, that nice glossy reflective surface. Now I've just used automotive polishes for that, so I had a heavier grade polish first, and then finish that up with a super fine grade. So now that our TE body is finished, the next thing we want to do is complete the neck. As you know, we sprayed this in a clear gloss, and what we want to do now is flat sand that headstock. Now I've already done the majority of that using an 800 grit paper. I'm following that up now with a finer grit paper, a 1200. I've got that wrapped in an eraser just to have a little more control. It can be a good option when you're doing headstocks, as it allows you to get into those hard to reach areas a little more easily with still not having to use just your hands basically. So I'm going to sand this headstock and just make sure the scratch marks from the 800 are out. It can be a little bit tricky to work up to the front of the fretboard like this, so the eraser is quite handy for that. It will conform to the curve but still give you a fairly decent base, as in it's not going to just ride over any bumps and lumps and things like that. And from here I'll follow this up with 1500 grit and then steel wool and then polish as we do with the body. And the back of the neck's a little different, so basically we want a fast playing neck. So what I would do is come through with my various grades of paper as we have with the 800 and now following up with the 1200, and once we're ready to steel wool, I would spend a lot of time on the back of the neck. So just using some fine grade steel wool, I'd really buff the back of the neck out. What you really want there is a nice thin finish. You want the timber sealed, but you also want the neck to play fast, and you'll generally be able to feel how the neck feels in your hands. So just keep buffing that up until you're at a point where you feel like the neck feels comfortable. So that marks the completion of the finishing stage of our TE guitar kit. So from here, we're going to be installing hardware, our electronics, and then doing a final setup of the guitar just to make sure it plays great. Alright, so we've got a fair bit of hardware to work with here, but the first thing we're going to do is install the pickguard. You've got to install the pickguard first, because if you install the neck first, the pickguard can't physically fit in place with that pickup already pre-mounted on the pickguard. So just take the wires and thread through the hole in the pickup cavity, in the side of the pickup cavity. You can leave that there for now. Don't be confused if you see another hole from the neck pickup cavity to the neck, out to the neck pocket. The hole's just drilled that way. It's easier to get a straight hole drilled. Just align that pickguard, make sure it looks good around this horn. There's some consistency to the gap between the edges. It also fits in the pocket reasonably well. And next I'd also just take the controls and just make sure they fit as well. Or I should say if they align well with the placement of the pickguard. Actually, one thing I would recommend is just to mask the pickguard in place as well, just so it doesn't move. You could also mask the controls for good measure, or tape them down, I should say. Although that alignment's just moved there. So I'm just using low tack painter's masking tape for this, so it won't cause any problems with the finish. Okay, now I just need a small drill bit. I'm just going to go in and mark those pilot holes. And lastly, I'm just going to check the bridge pickup location. Now, I'd be more inclined, if there's a problem at this stage, just to file this edge straight if that's the issue. That's why I'm checking the bridge pickup last. And that looks a good fit as well. I'll just sight that up from the side. Okay, so next we're going to drill our pilot holes. So I've got a drill bit in place. Now, if you want to know the depth, usually drill about 2/3 the depth of the screw. It's the easy way to do that, or the easy way to tell that, hopefully you can see that, is just use a little bit of tape on the drill bit at the depth that you want to drill to. Also a good idea, just before you install the pickup for the final time, just make sure there's no screws or anything attached. The base of the pickup's a magnet after all, so sometimes you find, especially if your packaging's loose, you might find a screw or two attached to the pickup. Of course, the reason we drill the pilot holes is because these screws are particularly, well, they're not particularly small, but some of the screws we're going to install in the body are quite small and obviously fragile, so very easy to strip. So it's definitely a good idea to drill your pilot holes. Don't skip that step. Actually, one step I have skipped, which we'll go back to. Another thing I should recommend that we should have done before installing or placing the pickguard is just to chamfer the edges of these holes. And that way, especially because we've got a solid colour finish, quite a few coats of clear, don't want to cause any chipping with the screws, so it'd be a good idea just to give the edges of the hole a light chamfer. All of the holes for that matter on the body that we're going to drill. And when we insert the neck, just make sure you put the heel in first and then bring the neck in and down like so, and then push into place. Do that because the edges of the neck pocket are now, they were always quite fragile, but now we've got finish on the paint can chip as well, so just need to be a little careful with that. I'm just going to take a small pad and just even up that body to the neck. So next we'll look at our tuners. So these are inline tuners. The the screw for securing the tuners in place faces back toward the body. And if you're going to align these to the headstock itself, you do one at a time, and taking a set square, you'd align these to the headstock. Or another way to go about things is to align them relative to each other. So using a steel rule, just to align them all like so. But first we'll have to secure them in place a little so they stay in place when we line them up. So just put the washer over the bushing and just screw in place. Your steel rule, just line up on the base like so. Just be sure they're spot on. Okay, so next we're going to install our strap buttons. The strap button location is fairly important because this will affect the balance of the guitar when you're wearing a strap. So generally want to get those right. Now, the strap button on a Telecaster guitar or a TE style guitar goes about halfway on the bass, and on the top horn it's about halfway down on that top horn. So the best way to find center I've found is to approximately place some low tack masking tape, run a steel rule down the guitar, just centered with the dot inlays and centered on the middle hole of the bridge. Once there, just mark your line. So we're marking the tape and not the guitar, obviously. And then taking a set square. Mark the rest of the line. Now the body should be 40mm depth, but we'll just check that. is. So I'm just going to find 20mm down. And from there I'm just going to mark my hole. Remove the tape. And I'll drill my pilot hole. So again, I've just measured the depth of this drill bit to be 2/3 the depth of the screw. I'll then try to keep my drill bit nice and straight. And again, just because it's a painted guitar, I'm just going to chamfer the edge of that hole a little. From there we can install that strap button. There is a little trick to these, which can make life a little bit easier. So first just find approximately half. And generally the strap button is dead in line with the top of the pickguard. So you can hold the pickguard, so you can hold the steel rule fairly level. Okay, so next we'll mark out the holes for our input jack. And this is obviously going to have to come back out again when we do the wiring. So for now, I really just want to drill some pilot holes. There's no real good way to align these, so I would normally just eyeball it. Just put the guitar up on the side like so. Get the alignment looking good. Just got the guitar, got the drill not straight up and down, and trying to match the angle of that slope so the screw's going straight. I'm quickly just going to chamfer those holes as well. Okay, so as mentioned, the next thing I'd like to install is this bridge and bridge pickup. Now there's a couple of things to keep in mind before we just put the bridge in place, and one is the earth wire from the control panel, which has to sit under the bridge. So if I bring the camera down, you can probably see just that small hole just on the side there, comes out at the top here. That's essentially your earth wire from the control panel. So the control panel is here, the earth wire runs, and the pickup wires run that way. The earth wire from the ground connections on the control panel run this way. then up through this hole, this slanted hole here, and out the top, and the bare wires will then rest under the metal plate of the bridge. The way I'd normally go about it, look for the ground wire, which in this case will be the wire on the left lug of the volume pot. Now you can tell the difference between your volume and your tone pots. Your tone pot will have a capacitor, which is essentially a filter, and the volume won't. So from here I would thread the earth wire through that hole, which will be at the bottom of the cavity. Now I just sit the control panel upside down in the cavity for that for now, and just make sure there's enough of those wires exposed at the end of the ground wire. So normally be a black wire, but may not, so on the odd chance that it's not, just make sure it's either the wire coming from the very back, the back of the volume pot, or the lug most left on the volume pot. I'm just going to push those wires up there like so. I'm really just going to leave that wire sit like that. And what I'd recommend as well is just to tape that off for now, just so it doesn't go back through. The next thing we'll need to do is thread our wires for our pickups. So again, these both will go through the hole in the side of the bridge pickup cavity, and if you're unaware, most of the time the bridge wires will be red, the neck wires will be blue, but you may want to make a note of that, as you won't be able to see the wires coming from the pickups once the bridge is installed anyway. So I've already drilled my pilot holes here and just chamfered the outside of that hole. So next I'm going to place the bridge. Just want to pull on the wires coming from the pickup as well, and then just check they're not preventing the bridge from sitting flat on the guitar. Then take your 3 longer screws in your packaging, put those in place. Okay, so next we're going to have a look at our wiring. And people get a little intimidated at this stage, or those who haven't worked on guitars before. It's easy to understand why when you look at wiring diagrams and hear strange terms like capacitors and potentiometers, but in a general sense, the way electric guitars work, we've got a pickup which generates a signal. It does that, it creates an electromagnetic field. When we strum a magnetic string over the top of that field, it creates an alternating current. That current is sent through these active wires, the hot wires. And if I connected my input jack directly up, so if I connected my ground wire here to the ground lug and my hot wire to the hot lug, plug the lead in, we could play the guitar. The pickup selector, tone pot and volume pot essentially just manipulate that voltage. So the pickup selector allows us to choose which pickup, neck, bridge or middle. The volume pot is essentially a variable resistor, so it controls the amount of voltage that passes through it. So if we turn the volume down, we're sending some of that signal to ground. And the tone pot works much the same way, except that voltage is directed to the capacitor, which is essentially a filter that filters out high frequencies. So none of these elements add anything. What they actually do is manipulate or take away or send more to ground of the voltage. So that's really all there is to it. So first thing we're going to do, as you can see, the green and white wire just up here, they're for the input jack, so I've just masked them off to the side for now. And one other thing you might like to do, I've just taken a rag and cut a slot in it basically just to protect the finish of the guitar. I've got that sitting over the guitar like so, and that way if any hot solder drips down, it will hopefully not burn through that, and although it's unlikely to happen, it's just a good idea to take precautions. Okay, so when it comes to soldering, you're going to need a few things obviously. So we need a soldering iron, we're going to need solder, and you should have more than enough solder in your packaging. I would also suggest keeping a slightly damp rag nearby just to keep the tip of your soldering iron clean. And really, that's all you need. So when it comes to soldering, if you haven't done any soldering before, soldering is a little different to what people expect. It's not the same as gluing something together. It's really a transferal of heat. So we heat up our soldering iron and we tin our soldering iron, which means we've got a coating of solder on the tip of the iron. That prevents the soldering iron tip from oxidizing. Once they oxidize, they're very difficult to work with. Solder doesn't, it balls up and falls off the tip. So what we need is a nice coating, and even when you're not using your soldering iron, it's a good idea to tin the soldering iron tip even when it's not in use. I'd also try and run it at the lowest practical temperature you can. So just find the temperature that the solder's melting comfortably, and don't increase the temperature any more than that. And we also want to tin our components. So in this case, I'm going to be tinning, which essentially just means applying a small amount of solder to these two lugs. So the second and third lug, and the second and third from the right as well. So the way to do this, just want to get a little bit of heat on the actual lug first, and just get a little bit of solder on there. And that'll just really help with the connections when they bond. So we need to tip our wires as well. So what I suggest is just loading up your iron with some solder, and just dragging through. Really just want a little bit on the tip. And these are the pickup wires. So as we know, the blue wire in this case is our neck, and the red is for our bridge. Okay, so if you look at our pickup selector, front position is going to be neck. Now just in case you're confused too, the pickup selector goes to the front on a TE style guitar, volume is next, tone is at the back. So we've got our blue wire here. Our blue wire here for our neck pickup. So essentially what we need to do from here, and this is a little tricky, so we need to wire to both the second and third lug. So we need to run the wire through the eyelet of the third lug and then across to the second lug. Once that's in place, just heat those lugs up a little again. just test the connection. That's fine. So don't be tempted to blow or cool down your solder joints prematurely. You'll get what's called a cold joint, which is more susceptible to having problems with the integrity of the connection. And next we'll do the same for the bridge pickup. So again, we're running through the second and third lug from the right. Hopefully you've got better eyesight than me, because I have a little trouble seeing these, to be honest. I usually use a magnifying light. It's a little hard to fit under the camera, unfortunately. Again, I'm just going to test the connection there. Okay. So the next thing we need to do is just solder these two ground wires coming from our pickups to, well, it wouldn't really matter. We could solder it to either of the pots, but I'm just going to solder both of these to the tone pot. So what I normally do here is try and get a puddle of solder on the back of the pot. Just heat it up enough first. Just going to kind of twist those together. You can bend the earth wire to suit, which is handy. I might be running my soldering iron just a little bit too low temperature there. So there's a bit of a fine balance. If we run our soldering iron too low, we're going to be applying heat to the back of that pot for too long. So I'm just going to heat that up to about 400. Okay, and we're good. So I'm going to remove that rag. just have a look at you. Okay, so we can see the green wire is coming from the back of the volume pot, so we know that that will be our ground. So just keep that in mind. And your wire colors might be different, so just check. One wire should be coming from the back of the pot. You could do this in the opposite order. You could hook up the input jack first before committing to installing the control panel, just to test your electronics first to make sure they're working. I'm not too concerned about that, but it's an option. So just remember, our green wire is our earth. Okay, so next we've got our input jack. So I'm just going to tin those lugs as well and retin the iron. Next I'm just going to tin these lugs. Just to explain input jacks. So we've got this arm here that secures the cable in place. It goes over the tip like so. Now our ground lug is the one that's actually connected to the inner sleeve. Our live lug is the one that's connected to the outside, and I'll explain how that works. So if you have your guitar cable, you can see we've got this rubber ring that separates the tip from the base. Pop the lead through, and so we can see our ground, the inner sleeve, is actually touching the base of the cable, and this arm is touching the tip, which is connected to the live lug. So if we connect those two wires up, we'll get a connection. Okay, so as I said, green wire, green wire is our ground. So I'm going to connect that up first. Don't need a lot of solder. Let's check the connection. And lastly, our active. Okay, so our last remaining job with our guitar kit is to install our string trees. Now string trees sit on the headstock and they serve to increase the downward pressure or the break angle of the strings over the nut. This prevents the strings popping out of their slots and also stops any rattle within the slots which may create a little bit of vibration. So the way these go, they're generally reserved for the E and B and G and D strings, and you'll notice one has a deeper barrel and one has quite a shallow barrel. So the deeper barrel, or the higher string tree, is obviously for the G and D strings, while the one with the shorter barrel is for the E and B strings. And I would just sit them You put them anywhere you like really, but I would bring them no further back. I would have the E and B in line with the tuner for the A string, and somewhere in between for the G and D string. You need to be careful here. We need to make a quick mark. So really what I want to do is just go down dead straight. Obviously we're doing this last because we needed the strings installed first, and we couldn't install the strings until the bridge was in place, in case you're wondering. And again, you'll see two different height screws. They insert like so, with the barrel section at the bottom. And they sit above the strings, so they're pushing down the strings. Okay, so now we've got the electronics connected and the hardware installed on this guitar. The last thing we want to do is just a basic final setup. Okay, so the first thing we want to do whenever we're doing any setup task is just to make sure the guitar is tuned to concert pitch. We want to make sure we've got the correct amount of tension on the neck before we start making changes. First thing we will check in the correct order is the amount of neck relief we've got. There's a couple of ways to do this. You can run a steel rule between the D and G strings and just get down to eye level. Just check you've got enough clearance over the frets. This one has very little. Or another way to do it, and perhaps more intuitive, just fret at the last fret and the first fret, and then just tap down at the 12th fret. The string should have some clearance over that 12th fret. In this case, it's virtually lying flat from here down, so I need to increase the amount of relief to the neck. Now, the way to increase neck relief is taking the Allen key that will be included in your packaging. What you want to do is loosen the truss rod. So we loosen the truss rod by turning the truss rod counterclockwise. So we put the Allen key in, feel around for the truss rod, and we'll turn this counterclockwise. Now, if for example you needed to straighten out the neck, we'd be tightening the truss rod, and that'd take some of the slack out of the neck itself. So I want to just turn this about a quarter turn to start with. You don't want to make major adjustments each time you're changing the amount of relief. And that's certainly moved. Got a little bit more play there, but I'm still not quite happy. Now I'm just going to check that tuning again as well, as it will invariably change. Okay, and I'm just going to turn this another quarter turn, or sorry, an eighth turn, counterclockwise. You can see we've got more play there again now. Okay, so next thing I want to do is check the action, which is the height of the strings from the fretboard. Now this is fairly subjective, obviously, but if you're not sure, or you need a good starting point, I would suggest 2.4 mil on the bass side at the 12th fret and 1.6 on the high E at the 12th fret. And a way to measure this is just taking a steel rule, or in this case a string action ruler, and you're sitting that on top of the fret, and you're measuring from the top of the fret to the underside of the string. So in this case, that's pretty much spot on. But in many cases, you will need to make minor adjustments. And the way to do that is just to adjust these individual saddles, the height of the saddles. Okay, so the way to adjust this, just turn the two screws on each individual saddle, and then you just bring the measure down again. Okay, so we've raised that action. We're just a little above 2.4 now, but I'm happy with that to start with. I tend to prefer a very low action actually, lower so I can get away with, but that'll do for a starting point. Okay, the next thing I want to check is the intonation. So again, I'm going to tune the guitar. So intonation is essentially checking if the guitar's in tune with itself. So what we're really doing is just compensating for the mass of the strings. So if I just get the tuner in the window there, so you can see we're tuned to concert pitch almost. Okay, so our open string is registering an E on the tuner. What we also want to do is go up an octave to the 12th fret and also C and E. As you can see, we're perfectly intonated there. Make sure, I know, we're looking a little sharp actually. Just check again. These strings are new, so they're going to bounce around a little bit, so I want to take the slackness out of the strings. Now, also just use the same attack on the string when you're testing the open to the 12th. So you can see we're just a little bit sharp there. So the way to compensate for that is we need to increase the length of this vibrating string. Now, the first contact point for the string is the saddle, and the second contact point is the nut. So the length between those two is the vibrating length of the string, or the scale length. So if your intonation's a little bit sharp, what you want to do is increase the length of that vibrating string. So you can see if I bring the camera up now, okay, so if I check the intonation now, check the open string. So you can see we're pretty much spot on. Okay, so the last thing I want to check is just the pickup height. Now again, this is subjective as well. It will largely depend on what you're hearing, but if you need a starting point, essentially what I would do is aim for about a 2.4 mil clearance on the bass side and a 2 mil clearance on the treble side. And you adjust these using or adjusting the mounting screws. And when you're measuring the height, you must fret at the last or second last fret and measure the height from the top of the fret to the underside of the string. Okay, so in this case that pickup is way too high. We're going to just need to bring that down a little bit. The way to do that, just turn this screw counterclockwise and that will lower the height. Now if you had individual pole pieces, this is a covered pickup, but in the case of the bridge pickup, for example, we've got individual pole pieces. You'd be measuring from the top of the pole piece to the underside of the string. And again, just don't forget to hold down at the last fret. Okay, so that's a little better, when still not quite at 2.4. So I'm just going to reduce that again a little bit further. As I said, about 2 mil on the treble side, just to compensate for the thinner strings. that's pretty much spot on now. So you do the same with the bridge pickup, obviously, and that's how you would adjust the height of your pickups. Now clearly I'm left-handed, so it's a little tricky for me to do a full demonstration of this guitar, but hopefully I can strum a few upside down chords, and we just test the different pickup positions on this guitar. So first I'm going to start in bridge position. You hear tones rolling off, and volume's working. So middle position, which is a combination of the two pickups. Volume's working well. And now neck position. Okay, now the important thing, I'm going to take my hands away from the guitar and hopefully we'll hear no interference, so no hum, no sound. That's good. Okay, so if you did hear any interference or hum at this point, that would probably indicate you've got an issue with your ground circuit. So I would go back into the electronics cavity and just look for any of those black wires we installed earlier and just make sure no connections are broken, there's no loose wires there. Okay, the last thing I would check is just the integrity of the neck. So what I would do is just run up and down the neck, playing each fret on each string, and so on. And what you're listening for there is fret bars or any dead notes. If you do hear any problems, you can then adjust the neck relief or adjust the action appropriately. Okay, so that's the end of the project. I hope you've enjoyed building your TE style guitar kit as much as I have. Thanks for watching.